everyone that's come tonight, from representing many disciplines, including students. We're in for, I think, exciting evening. I might view it in a little different way than we view normal lectures and Monday night lectures, that it's an opportunity for us to reflect on our own attitudes and how we propose to present ourselves in society as either environmental designers, planners, or specifically people that inhabit the earth, our attitudes and how we actually end up living a life that it might be a commitment to certain attitudes that are presented tonight. Andropogon is a company that's in Philadelphia. It's represented tonight by Leslie Sauer, and I think it's important to know that it's not the glamour story of the century. It started, as we were given the information tonight, it started at the dinner table, two couples, husband and wife, deciding that they would go into business. And they struggled for a number of years, about 14 by now, yeah. And the reason they struggled is because they did not approach it so much as a profession, but as a mission. And so they hit stumbling blocks, but they stuck to their guns, and they present in their design, in their environmental attitude, a real commitment and a philosophy. And I'd like to share with you, those of you that don't know Andropogon, it's seen in sidewalk cracks, roadsides, everywhere. And fortunately, the promotional literature that Andropogon Associates Limited provides for us becomes probably one of the best introductions to Leslie and her offering to us tonight. The question is, what is Andropogon? Despite its unfamiliar name, Andropogon is a common American field grass. Wherever the landscape has been disturbed, Andropogon is one of the first grasses to colonize the ground, providing a self-sustaining cover for the gradual return of our native forests. Andropogon appears as in fields as russet. It appears in abandoned croplands and pastures in the countrysides. It volunteers along the highways and even thrives on the dumps and wastelands of our urban cities. From an ecological viewpoint, Andropogon is one of nature's remarkable adaptations to stress and change in the landscape. The economy and elegance with which these grassy meadows heal the wounded landscape aptly describes the goals of Andropogon's work in ecological planning and design, to weave the landscapes of man and nature together for the benefit of both. I introduce to you Leslie Sauer.
I had to do one of these at SELA. One of us got a microphone like the Supremes, and the other had one of these things. What I don't know how to do is turn the lights off, which I'd like to do almost immediately. A, it makes me feel at home since I'm a college teacher. But secondly, I think the real introduction is what we do. For a number of years, we spent a lot of time trying to tell people about our philosophies, about the things we thought were important in design, but we have found the bottom line is people really do want to see what you do, what you care about, and what your concerns are. So I think that really is the best introduction. What I want to start with is some landscapes that are not ours, but that I think represent a lot of what pervades the profession. This sequence of extraordinary cabbages is at Disney World down in the Epcot Center. It is interesting that virtually everything in either Futureland, the World of Tomorrow, or in Epcot, which is meant to be a model community, is in fact modeled upon everything but the natural environment, which at least for me is certainly the foundation of a model community. This may be a very successful and effective landscape, but there's a fundamental failure to realize that plants are living things. And I think more than anything else, our goal has been to create a phenomenal amount of stormwater retention legislation, and it has had its impact. The most familiar impact is that you damage your own wetlands instead of the wetlands off-site. But in fact, the utter sacrifice of stream channels and wetlands still proceeds apace. To combine land and water in ways that are this dead are exactly the kinds of things that we wanted not to do when we set out to practice in Arboretum. It's a place where people go to learn about plants. It's where people go to get ideas about the use of plant material. The fact that this extraordinary kidney bean of mulch lying in the ground is also in a remarkable stream valley that is lined with beautiful hickories and surrounded by a beautiful oak beech forest has been completely ignored at this level. And one of the things we see as a very new landscape phenomenon is the bare ground syndrome. We used to put mulch around plants as a sort of temporary thing to keep them going for a while. Now the mulch in and of itself becomes something to maintain, and landscape maintenance firms will come around with herbicides, et cetera, so that you can have this forever. The sort of one of everything, the Noah's Ark approach, which is definitely left over from the Victorian era, is still very much with us. The idea is that plants should not touch each other is to me about as sensible as the fact that people should not touch each other. Their values I do not share. Plants in the real world grow in communities. There is no such thing as an individual plant. The plant community is certainly the most fundamental building block. And until we recognize these aspects of cooperation that are so apparent in real plants, I don't think we'll ever be able to use them in ways that are the kinds of things that we have really been striving to deal with. Even people with lots of money do this. It has become very, very much the style. If you pick up Progressive Architecture or any other major trade publication, you will see that this kind of landscape absolutely abounds. In fact, I find that the nut on the other side could really be perceived of as a tree, something to bring into our urban environments to make it green and alive. To me, it's very much a case of the emperor has no clothes on. This is not a worthy plant. I would not buy it. I would not use it. But in fact, they become extraordinarily popular items. And in fact, there's another one that the USDA has come out that is narrower, tighter, and more columnar than the one before. The fact that trees are about forest, about stratified landscapes, is all very, very much lost when we have this extremely single species approach. The idea that a living thing the size of a tree could really inhabit a box is again something that we're seeing very, very prevalent. These boxes now come with drip irrigation, and various nutrients can be brought to them. They are often excessively drained, a kind of American Medical Association approach to plant care in urban environments. And we get very, very upset about the fact that plants are do not find easy homes in the city, and yet we reveal these sort of attitudes of death over and over again, when in fact there is really room on the street to have provided space for living things. Because those needs were never really recognized, no one went to the trouble of making them. These trees, of course, are replaced about every 3 years because, in fact, they don't make it in these little sarcophagi that are set about. And, of course, low maintenance is an extremely hot item today. As Carol and I are fond of saying, the lowest form of maintenance is death, and we do see this in the landscape. We are quick to forgive this gentleman because, as you see, he's a dentist. And obviously the urge to drill holes in the asphalt is more than he can bear. And we may laugh, but what we are doing in the backyard garden is exactly what we were doing to the planet. We are taking an extraordinarily complex organic world and making it an inorganic world. And landscape architects who deal with the spaces between buildings, who deal with the places that we live our lives in, are the people who have to be advocates for this level of change, because nobody else is an advocate for this level of change. It is the landscape architect who ultimately has to speak for the natural environment and for the larger cultural environment. You are the design professional who is the yoke between these things. You are a professional. It comes from I profess, I believe. And for us, this belief structure has become the tail that has certainly wagged the dog that is Andropogon all these years. This is a project that was done up in Providence, Rhode Island, and it's 5 miles of this were completed before the engineer who designed it was driving along one day with his 5-year-old daughter, who said, "Yuck, Daddy, isn't that ugly?" And in fact, the project came to a grinding halt. Unfortunately, there are not enough 5-year-olds out there saying, "Yuck, Daddy, isn't this project awful?" What we accept in landscape architecture is really scary. I've talked a bit about plant community. It was for us the initial informing idea that somehow geometry and painting, that the vocabulary of bed, border, bosque, and allée would not be what motivated us, that we would try to look to plant community, became the goal behind Andropogon. We also believed fundamentally that an ecological approach is valid everywhere. It is not something you are privileged to do occasionally when you are given a project in the wilderness. It is not something that you do because your client wishes to have a naturalistic appearance, but that every single project that is done goes through an ecological lens. You will not be able to correct the ills of the world overnight all the time, but fundamentally it has to always be what you are trying to do, to find a different way of solving the problems that we traditionally solve at such great cost to the natural environment. All of the projects that I will show you are within 1 year after planting, except for a very few exceptions that I mentioned. We are interested in this in part because the marvelous thing about an ecological landscape is you don't wait for it to grow. The fact that the landscape is comprised of juvenile plants is not a major catastrophe in the natural world. It is typically a major catastrophe in the landscape world. You plant trees the size of a parking meter, spaced as if they were giant specimens that have grown for 200 years in an arboretum, and then the homeowner kind of sits back and waits for something to happen. There is a fundamental wholeness to the landscape when it is looked at ecologically. Every layer is important, not just the large trees. And in fact, plants do touch each other. They do grow together. And we feel make fundamentally wholer landscapes at the outset. I start out in the city, typically because people say, oh, it's a crummy little lot. It measures 13 by 20. How can you begin to restore or reweave any bit of a natural fabric? For us, every single site is the whole planet. Wildness must persist everywhere if the system is ever to be whole again. As planners, I spent years in the 60s, for example, railing against the fact that municipal boundaries were not the same as ecological boundaries. Why couldn't Pennsylvania be the watershed of the Delaware River so it would be more manageable? But of course it isn't, and it never will be, and those things aren't going to change. Ultimately, however, every piece of land will be reworked. And if we are busy putting systems back together again, taking streams out of pipes rather than putting them into pipes, reconnecting natural systems, and permitting a level of wildness to survive everywhere, ultimately the system will be reconnected. This urban lot, obviously we cannot go back to primeval forest when I'm dealing with a soil that has a pH of 8.5 because it's all concrete, and we are dealing with an extremely bare mineral situation. But I can go to a young successional old field scenario here with tulip poplars, dogwoods, viburnums. Becomes an extremely durable landscape, has the capacity to take a tremendous amount of stress, and it is complete at all layers, and has a quality, I think, of completeness that is not typical of a newly planted landscape. Water and the ways we deal with water are always important. On every site, our major goal is to get water back into the ground rather than conveying it away. Typically, of course, it is high a velocity and carrying as much erosion as possible. In this scenario, there is a whole sequence of little cobbled gutters throughout the paving, which in almost all cases, our paving is set on a very large and deep hardcore and sand base. We very rarely use a concrete slab in paving, and trying to maximize the amount of water that infiltrates into the soil in all cases, one of the things that happens is that these little runnels and gutters become opportunities for using plants that are often perceived of as fragile in the landscape, but in fact are not remotely fragile. Things like the maidenhair fern have a capacity to take hideous mineral soils as long as there is adequate moisture. Ferns in general become plants that when you start looking at the moisture requirements, you can begin to introduce very, very freely into the landscape. Another urban lot, this one in the Pennsylvania coastal plain, where we went to a much more coastal plain idiom. One of the things you can see immediately is that while we speak rather rapidly about native plants, we are certainly quite willing to tolerate a fair number of other plants in the system. There are a lot of potted plants here that are not native species. We use a lot of non-native herbaceous plants, but fundamentally the story is about the native forest. It is not about the boreal forest of blue spruces. It is not about Japan and Asian species that we have imported. It is fundamentally about the Philadelphia coastal plain. This is another small urban lot. In fact, it had so little soil available to us and only a single tree that ultimately we went to a small balanced life pond. You can see the edge of the pond here beyond the paving and the little pond itself. I think no matter how small, there really are opportunities to bring a level of diversity and complexity back into landscape systems that we have very casually watched disappear. Even here, it's a small industrial street in Philadelphia now undergoing condo conversion. It's a small service alleyway. It was an interesting situation because the orientation meant that one side of the street was basically always lit and the other side of the street was always in shade. There was certainly an extremely limited amount of soil available to us, period. And since the street still had to function, at least for service access and walking, it became problematic. But the people putting in the utility lines had very nicely dug up all these little holes in the concrete in order to get their utility lines in and left these little gaps behind. Our only requirement now was to find a tree that was light-rooted enough that it would not rip up the utility lines, but that would also tolerate this kind of light shade condition that we had. An obvious analogy are many of the small stream channels running through Philadelphia. They have similarly bare mineral soil like we find in the urban environment. And in this case, the river birch we used turned out to be both very light, and within 2 years the canopy had actually closed beyond. In this case, the little boxes were raised slightly so we could get a few inches more soil, begin to provide for them the kinds of things that are really necessary to support vegetation. But Carol and I spent a tremendous amount of time haunting every vacant lot and really studying volunteer vegetation to see who is willing to survive in what situations, where are they growing, what are the pHs, why did they germinate, where are the seed sources. And I find that the information that we are able to gather observing the real world often serves us with much more reliability than the information we were able to read in books. It might have been true for one person in their habitat, but it does not mean it will be true for me in my habitat. And again, I would certainly urge you to begin studying, especially serious stress situations along highways, adjacent to railroads, in urban situations, before you necessarily go along with what many of the books on urban vegetation will be telling you. This is a small courtyard in Philadelphia. This was an interesting project in part because in this condo conversion, what they wanted was curb appeal. They wanted it to look better so they could sell the units, but none of the construction inside had actually taken place. The courtyard was to be used for a staging area during construction, so all the rubble was thrown out of the windows onto vegetation. So we had to have plants that could tolerate a lot of spontaneous pruning without losing shape too much. Here again, we went to an old field scenario, young, successional, dynamic vegetation, so twiggy and multi-stemmed that it hardly notices when it is broken and torn apart. Here with the cedar and inkberry, as well as the hawthorns and crab apples. Looking for the natural analog is something that we do constantly in our effort to find a fit between the plant material and the place. The analog is real in the sense that we are trying to look for what are the environmental conditions here. Again, we're looking at another scenario analogous to a stream bank with bare mineral soils, low oxygen in the soil. We're also looking for an analog in terms of mood, the dynamism of a young landscape as opposed to the tranquility and stability you might find in an older landscape. This street, again, we looked at a stream bank scenario, and in every case, trying to find the opportunity for getting water back into the soil rather than running off, maximizing the opportunities for gaseous exchange with the atmosphere. At the street edge where people will be walking across the curb, we've gone again to a unit paver set in deep layers of sand so that we have good penetration, and the trees, rather than living in pits, are living in long continuous trenches with porous paving over them. And of course on the side where we do not need it, actually having soil at the surface. We have basic rules that we try to operate by in the office. One of the most fundamental is de-pave. If we end up on a project with more paving than was there beforehand, we most of the time have made a mistake. There are just tremendous opportunities to take impermeable surfaces away from the scenario. This is another conversion. In this case, we chose to leave behind the old walls of the buildings that had once filled the new courtyard space that was created. It was an old shoe factory that had both a masonry structure around it and then small wooden structures inside with low masonry walls. All the little wooden structures were torn out, but we left the old walls behind, in part respecting the old character of the building that was there. It's an extraordinarily mineral slope on a steep rocky slope in Pittsburgh. And here we are in the act of putting the landscape in, stealing outrageously from the black birch gap phase slopes that so surround that city. But in fact, it has done enormously well in the time it has been in this extremely Spartan environment of the court. Here we are, one of the trellises underneath. Again, you can see the porous paving that, and the unit pavers that went around the main paved area. This is another urban site. The big hole on the side is the actual entrance to the building, which will be on a bridge across that pit. The idea the architect had was that the poor people who had the basement apartments in the pit would at least have ground floor gardens to come out to. And part of our problem was, how do you provide a level of privacy for them, some sense that they are not being overlooked by the people on the bridge all the time, and how do we begin to do that while bringing light into the courtyards, which they so desperately need in this narrow pit, at the same time creating a landscape that the people on the bridge can actually move through. One of the interesting things was it was one of our first forays into using plants that far from conform to the American nurseryman standards. In this case, we found trees 1.5 inches in caliber, 32 feet high, that came from an old nursery where they had been allowed to, they'd been placed out as liner stock and hardly moved since that day. But in fact, they were absolutely perfect for us because they had this extraordinarily long limby quality, enabled us to have canopy over the bridge the day it went in, and yet trees that had been shaped by their environment to have this long, lean quality to them, and did not create a tremendous amount of shade for the landscape below. Once we felt free from those travels, we have now gone very far from the American nurseryman standards, and there are a host of nurserymen who are absolutely thrilled that they can get rid of all this appalling plant material with busted leaders, 3 trunks, crooked stems, etc., to the people who are always looking for them. One of the other things we did in this courtyard was to use a white gravel and river jacks in order to bring again the light color down onto the floor. The cobbled areas have been filled with fern rootstocks and ground covers to get them, to begin to green out. And again, it's a very, very easy environment for ferns, wonderfully protected by the stones themselves, and with the trellis above, a good degree of protection from being viewed from the bridge itself. And here we are moving through the little gardens. Again, this is still less than a year after the original planting. You can see the stakes are still on. We've hardly made any progress at all at that level. I want to look now not so much at so many small vignettes, but begin to look at a larger transformation where we were looking at the University of Pennsylvania, trying to reconcile both very traditional landscape concerns, but also trying to use plants in ways that reflected our understandings and concerns about plant community. The University of Pennsylvania is another Victorian campus. It was modeled very much on the English sort of Oxford and Cambridge style, beautiful greens, Gothic buildings around them. Unfortunately, there'd been an extraordinary post-war building boom, and all the new portions of the campus were looking about like this. Every surface of ground paved, the cheapest possible materials used at every turn, no thought to the environment of the city that had been there, but it had to get this bad before the university really turned around and said, where has our campus gone? And we undertook a very long and complicated master planning process. This was the central green, and the problems here were typical of virtually every evolving landscape. New buildings have gone in, old pathways no longer service them, so a whole network of gypsy trails begins to develop, and of course the asphalt pavers running along behind them, gradually filling in every corner. It got to such a point where it was clear to the pavers that ultimately they would pave everything. Therefore, they then turned to the Rysand-and-Yu theory of control of pedestrian traffic. And of course, what it meant was that students now started running across the campus and leaping these little hurdles of yew that were put up everywhere. Before we started work on the Central Green, there were 6 projects, 6 firms that sequentially had been given the job. In no single design was more than 30% of the green unpaved. In fact, in one design, the entire green was paved in brick, and it had little bumps in it periodically with statues of the trustees standing on the bricks. You laugh, if only this were the odd, freaky solution. It seems to be much more typical of an awful lot of what is going on in the design world. Our primary goal was to get it back to green and to reconcile the paving system. It amounted to taking out all of the original paving and going to a new scenario. We did have to tackle some very difficult problems head on. One was the width of paths. The University of Pennsylvania has 40,000 students. Periodically, there are enormous numbers of people moving through that green. A 25-foot path was the absolute minimum for major pedestrian ways, but we were able to go to a ribbon scenario, so it does look narrower when it is empty than it does, and it still accommodates the larger flow of traffic and has worked really quite effectively. One of the biggest battles, too, was to go to decent materials. The university was obsessed with the notion that even concrete was too great a luxury for an Ivy League institution that had to pay for the important education of its students. We dove into the maintenance department and found out that the repair rate on asphalt was so high that within an 8-year turnaround time, bluestone turned out to be cheaper than asphalt. Ultimately, we have found with our clients that the one group of people we cannot work with is the slash and burn developer. The person who is going to cut and run and bear no long-term cost is not someone we are able to work with and make a very sound case for ecological planning. But boy, if they stay more than a year or two, it is always more cost-effective to use durable, real materials, to respect the natural systems that are there, to not destroy the system that may support you ultimately. One of our major concerns, of course, was to get past these shabby materials, and secondly, to provide barrier-free access in a way that did not single out the handicapped as the people who had to drive little carts onto funny little boxes that lifted them into buildings. So there was a complete elimination of all stairs and steps throughout the central green and the whole central pedestrian walking system. Another big battle was what we think of as the Mickey Mouse or McDonald's landscape, this intense frittery bit, usually a dedicated garden given by someone, something that people care very, very much about, but that is draining a tremendous amount of energy away from sustaining a larger landscape to provide a lot of intensive care for a frittery little landscape. This one, happily, as were most of the ones at Penn, were also ugly, so it was easier to talk people out of them once it had been presented to them that these, in fact, were ugly. But we do find that, like the little girl that tells the emperor he has no clothes on, we do have to stop and point out to people that these are ugly things. There is such an easy acceptance of landscape. Philadelphia is a big horticultural town, too. You can sell anybody anything to do with plants, and a tremendous level of support. And they will be furiously pouring funds and energy into something that, in fact, nobody actually values when they are asked to confront that. And moving, hopefully, towards a much more dramatic, large-scale, easier to maintain kind of landscape that is more characteristic of the university. Throughout this central green, our model was the Lowland Forest. It is a very tall, high-canopied, lofty, ivory tower kind of landscape, not characterized by dramatic change. It is not an old field of bustling activity. And it seemed to be appropriate to the ivory tower character of the existing campus. One of the other issues on at Penn, as it is with most campuses, was parking. This lot, though very small, was singularly intrusive since it occurred on a little knoll overlooking the whole of the green. These little fiefdoms of ancient professors were very difficult things to eradicate, but again, it was something that we tackled as fiercely as we could. The biggest problem we had, of course, is when the paving came up, there was nothing under it but rubble. It is now, however, an open-air cafe that the students use and has proved really quite successful at that context. This is, again, everything is still almost under construction. This is at the campus's edges. Classic problem we looked at a little earlier on the site, which is the plight of the street tree. We will not put a tree in a pit. It is not something I can do in good conscience. These pit trees were averaging about 3 years if they were lucky. Typically, they would go in and not grow, but maybe take 3 years before they had actually died. Again, one of the biggest issues for us was depaving and trying to get the whole of the area that had now been converted to asphalt and to make it a growing medium for the trees. It meant, again, going to a unit. When we took up the asphalt and all the core that was beneath it, we had a soil to replace. Which was a dull gray subsoil. It seemed to need several things, one of which was some organic matter, and another of which was sand, since it was extremely compact and had a high level of clay and didn't drain very well. We used a mixture of sewage sludge and sand. We use a lot of sludge, primarily in urban environments where we have very, very high pHs so that we do not have the migration of heavy metals. We are dealing with aquifers that are never drunk from, that are already contaminated, so I feel safer. But in fact, I think the city is a great place to begin to use sludge because of the high pH. Any city not built of wood, where you have concrete as a major element in the building and cement, you can very reasonably hit pHs that are circle neutral or higher on a routine basis. This site was over 9 when the airline was going. The asphalt went into the soak pits. We, in fact, measured the amount of void space that busted asphalt gave us in the pit, and then a little gravel was put on the top, since it's a little more attractive than busted asphalt. The next step is beginning to tie down the curbs so that the water can go into the area that is now covered with gravel. The wheel stop is used, so we don't even have to pave the area that the wheel does not go on. The overhang is able to be open, and in fact, the street is back in landscape. We do have an emergency overflow on this site. We have teams of people who go out after every major storm to look at the areas, and this is one of the many sites that we have never yet seen the overflow flow. So it's amazing what you can do, decentralizing stormwater, beginning to put it back into the ground all over the place. I want to talk a little bit about vegetation management, since in fact landscape architects plant a remarkably small proportion of the world. If we look around us, most of the landscapes are managed for other reasons. They're managed by golf courses, they're managed as retention ponds, but they are certainly not managed as gardens. We are very interested in the restoration of landscapes. It gives me nothing but joy to come and ride all the way from Dayton to Muncie and drive through landscapes that are so undisturbed compared to what I see. Philadelphia, when I first started really to know it 25 years ago, looked just like the land I drove through. You could drive 10 minutes out of the city and it was pastoral landscape. Now, every remnant of the pastoral landscape is a tragedy. It is a collapsing barn left as a fragment in a huge subdivision. It is really terrifying what has happened, the level of deterioration. The things I have seen in half a lifetime, I expected to have to live to 90 to begin to see. I cannot drive, I have to drive more than 3 hours away from the city in order to find a landscape that is not overwhelmed by disturbance species. The big exception is the Jersey Pine Barrens, which is still in remarkably good shape. These are some of the sites that we have been working on in management. Oldfield management is something we are extremely concerned about. Wildflowers have a terrific name right now, although it's an awful lot more difficult to get them to grow than the advertising. The meadow in a can would certainly have you believe. This is, of course, what we have in mind. This is, in fact, a retention area maintained in wetland herbaceous species, Joe Pye, New York ironweed, and goldenrod. In the end of summer, the site is in full flower and the ground remarkably dry. And in fact, in this case, grass paths are mown through it only for the few summer months of the year when it becomes a virtual herbaceous border for the people to go through. Unfortunately, this is what old fields on the East Coast are beginning to look like. The forest does not return. In fact, it is becoming a landscape of honeysuckle, things like miscanthus, alien grasses, Norway maple. It is not coming back at all. And we find that this is our biggest enemy. We have been working quite extensively with the National Park Service, and one of the major issues has been the reduction of lawn. On every single site where lawn has been eliminated, the most overwhelming thing that has happened is the instantaneous presence of invasive exotic species all along the East Coast. So we spend a great deal of our energy trying to control them. For those of you who don't have them yet, who have the opportunity to keep them out of your landscape, I hope this says something compelling to you. One of the difficulties with dealing with meadows is that we're in perennial landscapes. This is Andropogon, for example, when established by seed. For those of you who've seen it on the roadsides, 3 years of work from seed, and this is a pretty pathetic amount of cover. It is true with most of our wildflowers. They go in very, very poorly by seed in our perennial landscape. The first thing we did was to really begin to look at the options of let's forget about this seeding business. I've got turf. I don't want turf, but I want bare soil less than I want turf. So we now have largely abandoned the reseed scenario and have moved much more towards management. First of all, start ignoring and mistreating the turf so that the turf grasses, all of those of you who've had turf management, can turn this upside down when you want to make a meadow and actually do things that you know will not favor the turf. And so our first thing was really beginning to let it grow out and then going to an overseeding scenario. Once we've begun to exhaust the turf grasses, the overseeding becomes fairly reasonable. Actually, those two were flipped. This is when it is first grown out. We like to let it grow out for a season or two before we start working with the grasses, then overseeding, and just seeding in the furrows themselves. You waste a little seed, but in fact you can begin to get the wildflower cover quite effectively at that point in time, and you have not gone through a period of large erosion and trying to work so hard at restabilizing. Still, there are situations where you need seed And because all the seeds are grown, at least all the seeds available to us are grown largely in California and prairie states, we have started hand collecting seed with the Brandywine Nature Conservancy and actually commissioning them to collect seed for us. This is one site, first season after seeding. We now collect from whole fields rather than sitting around and saying, oh, I think I want 10% of this and 20% of that, and pulling it out of the little rabbit warrens of our own minds. We would just find a field that is analogous, relatively the same soil conditions, and just say, give me the whole mix. It's something we hope to be working on much, much more extensively in the future. And we are also now working with propagators to get vegetative plugs. In a perennial landscape, if I could put it in like zoysia and plug it into the landscape, instead of trying to go from seed, I would have very good cover very rapidly. The problem, of course, is the cost, and how do you break a new grass into the market. Although we had had years of wanting to have a tremendous diversity of all the meadow species that we saw in natural meadows, it was obvious we'd never get a propagator to work with all of them, so we went to the backbone species, obviously Andropogon, and are now commissioning our propagator to get Andropogon. 3 months from the commission, we can have flats like this. This is from one clone of Andropogon dug up in a field. We will never take more than 10% of that field. We can get anywhere from 40 to 60 slips from that, and within 3 months' time, we have a marketable commodity. It is still costing us almost 40 cents because we're using a lot of hand methodology, but we've just gotten a very large contract for the propagator with the National Park Service, and we hope to be able to bring the price down. That helps us in open landscapes. When it comes to closed landscapes like the forest, we are now working with low bush blueberry, which is the most versatile of our low stabilizing shrubs, and we'll see how that's going. We're just getting the first things from the propagator right about now. Fire, for those of you who are able to pull it off, is without question the ultimate renovator of old field landscapes. We find it is the fastest route to vegetative diversity. Nothing else comes close. I think part of the reason it worked so well, in particular in our perennial landscapes, is that it does give the perennial herbaceous plants a phenomenal edge. We tend to burn real late in the winter, and you get a deliverance of broken down nutrients to the plants that have existing root systems rather than to something that is germinating. You, of course, have good control of trees and other woody competitors. You probably also, by burning away the old dead volume of vegetation, you probably also reduce the extent to which plants like goldenrods and asters actually inhibit themselves. The litter is typically and frequently quite toxic, the object being probably to control the germination of woody species, but ultimately we see this redounding back on the plant, dying out in the center of the clone, and we are finding on the sites that we burn, the clones of goldenrod, which might have had a lifespan of 9 or 15 years, and then they sort of move on, are not dying out. They seem to have a sort of continuously rejuvenated aspect to them. Our single biggest problem is highways. We're too built up, and I cannot burn so close to a road where the issue of traffic and blinding people is going to be a problem. Another problem we frequently encounter is airshed regulations. Philadelphia is a very strictly controlled airshed. However, there is still little enough burning done that we put down research purposes and are almost always able to get away with it. And if you ask the local volunteer fire company, we have found it never takes more than an invitation and a keg of beer to get them out. In all honesty, these are the guys who are setting half the fires anyway, and there's nothing they like a good fire. And if I can keep them from burning barns by giving them fields to burn, then I'm happy as a clam. And a well-managed old field is something that is in fact utterly acceptable to the corporate mentality. You do not require acres of dead grass and lollipop-shaped trees to have a landscape that really has some elegance. One of the biggest problems with an ecological approach is that the transition time can be very murky. You're going from a very rigid, controlled environment to something where you are asking the natural systems to sustain themselves, and it's just like taking a kid out of an institution and throwing it on the streets. There's a lot of murkiness in between. But once the system is back and functioning, it has all of the elegance that we require. Forest management is another issue we are very interested in. I show you this slide because it is in fact a planted landscape. It's an old quarry site that was planted in the late 50s by a man named Russell Wright, who was an industrial designer who had an absolute genius for recreating the patterns of the natural landscape. On this 70-acre site that he worked on, which is now a nature center in New York called Manitoga, this was possibly one of his most outlandish endeavors, which was to create a primeval forest, or something that looked like the ancient cathedral forest on the bare banks of a quarry. One of the things he did, too, was to use a lot of artistic genius to create these feelings. These hemlocks have all been limbed up and pruned up, all those branches that time would have taken away as that forest closed, Wright pruned away to give them the look of the older landscape. His laurels were all pruned up to be lean and leggy looking, like they were reaching up through the gaps in a forest environment. And in fact, this industrial designer, theatrical designer, managed to create something absolutely extraordinary. Unfortunately, this is probably the way that we will have to go in a lot of the landscapes that we are looking at. We are now doing 5 sites for the New York City Department of Parks, and we are spending upwards of $2.5 million a hectare to reestablish landscape systems that have collapsed. Working in these different municipal park systems is like moving through time. I go to Philadelphia and I see what New York had 20 years ago for a few $1,000s an acre. They could have saved themselves millions of dollars that they are spending. I go to Wilmington and for $50 they could save themselves the problems that Philadelphia is dealing with right now. You people have something more pristine than any of those cities will see. And it really is a remarkable challenge to you to learn from the older cities on the east what not to do to the landscapes around you. This, of course, is what our forests are looking like, not very foresty. One of our single biggest problems we have to deal with is phenomenal volumes of dead wood. Dead trees all over the place. Typically, we will have 60 and 70% of the canopy dead. Water tables dropped 4 feet, stream floors dropped 5 feet, and is draining the water out of these systems. We rack our brains to come up with ways for using wood on site as part of a restoration effort. I think we're the only people building check dams out of untreated wood every 10 feet in major ravines and are thrilled that it's going to be eaten by termites in 3 years because I have more wood to get rid of. We're building snake hibernation sites and everything possible to not carry that wood off site, not to chip it and dump it somewhere else. Our single biggest problem, without question, is Norway maple. For every environment, there is an invader who is uniquely suited to that landscape. This is typical of this Asian invasion. This, to me, is the real yellow peril. The rest of the landscape is in full, is losing its leaves. And this plant betrays itself because it is timed to its older cosmic clock. You can see that every single piece of woody vegetation reproducing in that landscape is Norway maple. All native reproduction has come to a grinding halt once this plant enters the landscape. That road cut was made 5 years before this picture was taken. This is the speed with which this is happening. There are sites along the Hudson where the Norway maples are now 150 years old. They stand up on prongs that look like mangroves. There's been several feet of erosion around them. When you have a total Norway maple takeover in the forest, there is typically no other living plant. If you're lucky, you might have some honeysuckle at the edges, but I can take you to sites that are 100% Norway maple. Everything obliterated in its path. This is, of course, what we used to do to them. We have now found more inventive ways to kill them and actually don't have to chop them down to kill them. One of our biggest personal battles has been with the issue of herbicides, to use them or not to use them. We never use them in a situation where we are dealing with a client who has any ethical, moral, or whatever reason for not using them. There is always an alternative. However, our personal bargain with the devil is to use them on what we think of as the 10 least wanted list, which are those plants we consider so dangerous to the remaining natural habitats that we will use an herbicide. Our effort has been to absolutely minimize the amount of herbicide used by being extremely effective with it, and to be extremely selective about how we use it. We always use mechanical methods as well. In the case of something like large perennial vegetation, such as this Norway maple or honeysuckle, we will typically remove it repeatedly mechanically. If I can use a combination of burning and mechanical removals beforehand, trying to exhaust that rootstock, we use it. And then we deliver the herbicide only to the point where 6 weeks later, that plant is showing resurge. The places where it is vitally alive and coming back are the places that we will get it. We don't have to use a large foliar spray, maximizing the amount of drift, maximizing the amount of herbicide. None of what we're doing now would have been possible if we had not found a chemist at DuPont whose interests were similar and took an upward and outward early retirement plan and has now devoted his life to this. I'm pleased to say that the most recent experiments we've been doing with Norway maple using Garlon 4, which is an oil-based herbicide, in a basal oil, we're actually now on trees up to 6 and 8 inches in caliber, able to get away with just a stripe painted around the tree. Our rule of thumb is double the size of the caliber. So if I got a 4-inch caliber tree, I make an 8-inch wide stripe. The nice thing is it's a non-contact toxic herbicide. So if I have a child who comes into the park and touches that tree, I don't have to worry about the fact that something has penetrated through the skin, and we're getting stone-dead trees within a relatively short, and we don't have to tear them down, we don't have to rip them out. If it's in a situation where I can leave a snag, I can leave a snag. We don't have to go to the effort of cutting it down. And one of the things we've been working on through an NEA grant is trying to put a sort of absolute minimal herbicide, but yes, just a little bit to get the Huns of these landscapes under some level of control. This, in fact, is Turney Hernandez, who's the man we've been working with, in this case, using a more foliar spray. But it is something that we have finally said, if it's on that list of totally invasive exotic, we will use it. In this case, one of the things we are constantly having to deal with in forest systems on the East Coast is with fragments of forests that are so narrow that they've been completely overwhelmed with vines. In this case, we're using a weed whipper with a blade rather than a thread and severing the contact with the ground. And these are the volumes we're talking about of vine material. It's just a thrill to look at hedgerows that are not heaping mounds of vines. Yours will be, though. It happens very, very quickly once they're in the landscape. And then coming back and only treating the points of resurge. Here again is a landscape that looks not so dissimilar to the kinds of relic landscapes you have. It's a hedgerow that, in fact, was in the earlier pictures that was entirely heaping vines, and we have now begun the work of renovating the meadow around it so that we can go back to a pastoral context. That thing that must seem ineffably boring in your hours' drives around your countryside is something that we are putting a tremendous level of energy into trying to restore. This is pretty typical of what has happened to most of our stream systems. I mentioned the phenomenon earlier, but when people got very, very excited about stormwater management, they got very, very excited about the big flood. So we have 50 and 100-year retention basins all over, but the outlet pipe is big enough to drive a Honda through. And the one-year storm, which is now maybe 10 times the volume it was before they put in the parking lot, is now barreling through and collapsing the banks right and left. To deal with this at the level of stormwater, to start getting the water out of the pipes, out of the culverts, is an extraordinarily expensive procedure, but we are beginning to do it. We are starting take the water out of the pipe of the 5 big culverts that go down the hill on Swarthmore College. But we find that before we can attract people to give any money to take the water out of the pipe scenario, often we have to show them a level of improvement, and that comes with vegetation. This is a site in Fairmount Park, and we work a lot with volunteer crews. There are an awful lot of gardeners who now live in condominiums and high-rises who are enormously frustrated and quite willing to engage in forest restorations efforts. We've been, over the years, trying to put together a manual, which I hope will be out at the end of the year, for these kinds of groups. This is one site in Fairmount Park where one volunteer group has been planting trees. One of our biggest problems there is that as soon as you plant it, it is stolen by someone who wants to put it in their backyard. And we've had to derive a new planting method for bare root material. You'll notice, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a big, thick tape. And that stake, the tree is lashed to this, it's taped to the stake, which is then driven 3.5 feet into the ground, so they cannot pull it out come hell or high water. It has turned out to be the best bare root planting technique we've ever used, though, in that those roots do not move. And it's worked quite effectively. This group, after completing nearly 1,000 trees, has moved on to shrub material, the native to the landscape, which, in fact, Harrison, you'll be interested to hear, we're getting all from John Collins' prison farm growing program. He's got a group of prisoners. It's called the Pennsylvania Landscape Architect and Nurseryman's Training Program, and they're growing native plants that are unavailable. We can get the plants out. We haven't been able to get the prisoners out yet, but we're working on that. Fire in the forest, again, is something that is much overlooked. So many of the natural processes that were inherent in a real landscape have just been eliminated. We've altered the hydrology so fundamentally. We have drastically changed air. One of our biggest problems, for example, is hydrophobic soils. These are soils that will no longer absorb water because they have a slime of hydrocarbons from automobile exhaust that has coalesced across the surface. There are many of the areas that are suffering severe acid rain problems are also suffering from this problem of hydrophobic soils. When the forest fires outside of Los Angeles burned, in fact, what came out of the fire was automobile exhaust, not the things that should come from a forest burning. All these chickens are gradually coming home to roost, but fire is a way of beginning to address some of this, and it is one of the few natural processes that we can begin to put back into the landscape. We find at every turn the results of fire are always better than we ever imagined possible. And when it comes to something like Norway maple, I had been very curious if we could control Norway maple by where we went to, rather than everything runs off into the stream, was just the opposite. Everything runs into the ground and gets to the stream the slow way. Not only did we take all the drainage from the parking lot, which was all that they were required to retain, but we took all the drainage from the lawn areas, because everyone knows that lawn flows water like asphalt. We took everything from the rooftops and put it into large recharge beds that were located underneath the parking lots. We used a porous paving over the recharge bed in order to make that work. This is a detail of the porous paving. For those of you who might be familiar with porous paving, all of it's been a bust. Please don't judge us by failed products. You cannot put it down like it's asphalt. We have had to reinvent every single drainage detail to make it work, but it's working quite well. We have a 40% void space, and when you have the huge area of the parking lots, you can put an awful lot of water beneath it. These are the cells. Each one were these shallow retention and storage beds. The perforated pipe is bringing water from the rooftops and the lawn areas. This is the gravel going in. These are the porous beds installed. And this is a porous bed during Gloria, which is the largest storm we have had in the last 15 years. And as you can see, it comes down the access road, which is regular paving, and hits those recharge beds, and it's just gone, 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 gone. In terms of the overall landscape character, we again were looking at a pastoral idiom. It was an extremely tight site. I'll go through these fairly quickly. There's small hedgerows, sweet gum and sassafras, with larger sort of lone wolf trees on the side. A lot of long, narrow hedgerow landscapes. In this case, a little black cherry, much more irregular black cherry ash hedgerow and a swale, You can see a lot of twin trunk, triple trunk trees characteristic of browsed landscape. A lot of these were collected from old fields. A red cedar old field with an extraordinarily rich herbaceous layer as it's going in. And then a little woodland glade, which is the little garden that the dining area looks out on. Again, you can see we're really interested in the ground being alive rather than dead. Birth and death should be things to celebrate, not things that are absolutely appalling because they happened in your landscape. One of our biggest problems was out back. There was an old fill slope which had been considerably more stressed during the construction process. The stream had changed its channel 3 times during construction. This is pretty typical of what happens after years of runoff and losing recharge on a system, and the slope was collapsing. The original plans before we'd gotten there had been to stabilize this with K31. You can imagine how well that would have worked. We used instead a European brush layering method where you put in fresh cut live woody stakes. They have to be 40% willow. They are buried in the soil. The tips are exposed, trapping sediment and water. And of course, if you have a flood, it creates a lot of velocity dissipation, so it drops the load. This is the site upon installation with the brush layering in. This is about March 15th, and this is by July 2nd. We have 3-foot tall woody color across the whole of the site. It's an extraordinarily durable system. The last thing we tackled was the restoration of the piece of woods that we have saved. You can always find the woods, you just follow the trash pile. We felt that rather than have people go to the lunchroom via the parking lots, that in fact a journey through the woods would certainly be a different experience for those people at DuPont. I will say that at DuPont we never saw anything but a white shirt. They don't even wear a blue shirt at this state institution. So we thought getting them into woods would be really a good idea. The problem was that there was another building nearby our own which was pretty hideous, and this was the entrance to our woods from the rest of the area. We talked them into footing the bill for building a large trellis over that insignificant entryway so that we would have a kind of gateway into the forest itself. Here we are under, and pulled little islands of forest to begin to close that gap between their campus and the forest itself. Began an immediate purge of all the honeysuckle, and this is the little woodland path that resulted. It had to be paved because they wear, you know, spike heels, and the Kubota has to be able to get through in the winter to clear the snow. The path is laid at grade rather than with any excavation, which is why there are these little teeny-weeny bits of fill on the side, but it enabled us to go very, very close to very special things in the landscape. We started to program, we had started the idea of reintroducing the wildflowers into this landscape. In fact, when we took the honeysuckle out, they came back by the thousands. We had huge clones, acre-sized clones of mayapple, all infertile vegetative stems. They'd obviously sprung from long dormant rootstocks. So the explosion of wildflowers was absolutely phenomenal. The people who worked here became obsessed with the plants, and ultimately we had to go through and label everything. I'd be out at 7 in the morning and an executive would come up and say, "What's this? What's that?" And he'd say, "Don't tell Fred I asked you. I'm just going to impress him. I got this new guide," and things like that. But our goal was to give them a value for this forest so they wouldn't come and put another building there sooner or later. And I think on that note, it's about where we end. We straightened it out periodically. Basically, you have to have 120 feet just to bend a piece of pipe. We had to have pipe bending equipment. So we had 4 stations where they could bend pipe, and we would straighten it out in places. The most interesting thing, though, on the plan is that the bike path looked twice as long as the original alignment. It turned out to be less than 200 feet longer per mile. It's astonishing how much ground you can cover without actually adding a lot of length. If we had had 50, 60, 80 miles of pipeline, they never would have bought a damn thing. It was only because it was a relatively short stretch that was anything to get this county park off our hands. But it turned out to be not so much more expensive, because once they put the $15,000 into this piece of equipment, they had no restoration to do. You know, the site was put back to rights. The guys on the crew who had been very ornery at the outset, what bulldozer operator wants some broad telling him how to run his equipment? What pipeline person who's been in the business for 30 years wants some airy-fairy landscape architect telling them what to do? I mean, at every turn, it was sort of set up to fail. But by the end, they were really proud. And in fact, the heartbreaking part is that these guys think they have invented and worked on cutting-edge technology. And in fact, there's no earthly reason it will ever be done again, because no one's going to put a gun to the heads of these companies and say you don't really need 100 feet in order to do this. If we had not had a small pipeline company, in fact, they've now been Algonquin's now been bought up by Texas Eastern, a giant company. We never would have gotten as far with a big company. We had a local contractor who happened to have a gadget freak at the top. I was originally working with hay bale equipment, trying to move small pieces, almost sod size, down the line, you know. And he said, forget that, I got heavy equipment, sweetheart. You wouldn't believe, you know, what do you need? And I said, well, I'd like 8 feet wide, if you really want to know the truth. And he said, piece of cake, you know, I got a new backhoe. So, in fact, one of them did a beautiful little drawing at the end of this monster backhoe with a little turtle on the front, and it's carrying it across the right-of-way. So they really got into it in a big way. In fact, it's the only pipeline crew that, in amongst all the beer, always carried Perrier for my partner, Carol. So. But you know, we come out, we squeeze them and hug them and really love them up. I mean, you know, I cannot offer them what some macho, I can't tell them war stories, but I can squeeze them. It's, you know, it's often a tremendous advantage, I find, to be female, because they've had so much training in manipulating men and playing power games, and they haven't a clue, particularly when you deal with people like DuPont. I mean, they were helpless. They had no idea what to do with us. So they listened. Any other questions? Yeah.
When you were taking some of those raw sites, particularly the wetland sites, and allowing them, maybe encouraging, accelerating succession, they get to where you want them to be. Then, where do you go? Do you let them keep on going on into the future, or do you really
I have no hope that in the megalopolitan corridor that I live in, that you can just let it go. Unless you are looking at 1 million acres like the Pine Barrens, where there may be internal portions that are relatively secure. There's nothing that isn't getting worse. We have a requirement before we will work with a client that unless we have 5 years management of that landscape, whether it is, you know, street trees around something in the city, or whether it's something with the National Park Service, I won't touch it. I know now that if we turn it over to conventional care, the system is doomed, pure, you know, plain and simple. And we are now, I mentioned, for example, we're working on this management manual. We are getting very heavy into workshops and retraining. I've got 5 workshops with the National Park Service already. Every time they touch the ground, they destroy it. You know, the idea of taking care of a forest is to clear all the brush out, you know, brush. I mean, it's every canopy replacement tree. It is the whole works. So we're now going very heavy into maintenance and management of systems, period. Whether it is what we call the minimal lawn, which is how to have a lawn that meets minimal standards, you know. It's not a great lawn. Certainly, one of the people I had dinner with would not like my lawns, but the person can keep it up and minimal in area. I try to keep a very small, limited area of relatively well cared for turf. but basically trying to have something that is let go on all sites, something that is wild, and where succession is happening on every site. But there's no such thing in our area as natural succession anymore. I mean, it's just, unless you monitor and putz around and stop the odd invasion, you're just in big trouble, and there's nowhere that we don't.
What were the other 9?
Actually, there really aren't 10. I'm thrilled to say there aren't actually 10. Norway maple is our single big, I mean, if there was one plant I could destroy, when I retire, I want to put a gasoline tank in my backyard, fill it with Garland 4, get a backpack wand sprayer, and go out every day and kill every Norway maple on the East Coast, if you must know. Although I have a mycologist now whom I'm trying to get to teach me how to inject oyster mushroom fungi, and I want to make a whole business of itinerant oyster mushroom farmers of the Norway maple woodlands. Norway maple, sycamore maple locally is as problematic as Norway maple. You go to upstate New York, the two of them are twins. I mean, they just move through the landscape together and are almost indistinguishable. Honeysuckle, without question, is right up there. The Polygonum cuspidatum, Japanese knotweed, Mexican bamboo. It has a host of names. It's in the buckwheat family. Absolute terror, moving through our decimated stream systems. Absolutely, totally. We are now having very serious kudzu problems in Philadelphia. People like to think that kudzu is a southern vine, that it dies back to the ground in the winter and never got in the north. It is a southern vine because that is where they planted it. It is the nurseries in Georgia churning out 4 million seedlings a year for those highways that went in. That is why it is everywhere. If they had been putting it in the northern landscape with the vigor they put it into the southern landscape, well, the interesting thing about it is it does die back to the ground for the first few years, but as soon as this trunk, as soon as it establishes a little trunk, it can overwinter. So what we see is instead of eating 70 feet of barnyard in 1 year, it'll take it 3 years to get to a point where it'll suddenly eat it in 1 day. So it puts a lot of energy into the root system, a lot of energy into getting a winter-resistant stalk, and it just sits there, and then all of a sudden it's ready, and it just happens like that. Those 4 and purple loosestrife are probably right there, are our top 5. Pardon? Crown vetch? Crown vetch is absolutely fine. I was scared witless because people were putting it everywhere in our landscape, and they still are putting it everywhere in our landscape. But it is not demonstrating a people are always asking me, what do you call a Hun? To me, a plant I will use an herbicide on is a plant that will move into what passes for a natural landscape. Obviously, it's not wilderness. It's got some stresses. It's relatively undisturbed. But if this plant, by virtue of simply proximity, I don't have to run a bulldozer through it, but if it's in the neighborhood, if it invades and displaces native habitats, then it's on my off list. Vetch does not do it where we are. Ampelopsis, porcelain vine, does it all over mid-New York, and it's utterly, or so far appears to be utterly harmless in Philadelphia. And we have real neo-natives, like the cork tree, Elmer cork tree has moved into the woodlands, and it just seems to be another tree in the woods, It doesn't appear to be eliminating other species in its path. I'm not thrilled that it's there, but I'm not going to get too agitated about it. Ailanthus is, for example, taken over massive areas of the disturbed city, but it doesn't get into undisturbed, doesn't get into the natural area. In fact, I'm grateful for it because it greens huge bombed out sections of the city. I can put it on a zinc mine and it grows just fine. So the fact that it's rapacious is not a problem. Our greater problem is that our ailanthus has a disease now, and I cannot get a pathologist to look twice at it. In fact, it has been such a problem, Carol and I have christened it AIDS, ailanthus in distress syndrome, because for the same reason, nobody's looking at it because it's ailanthus. And interestingly enough, it doesn't seem to be as threatening as I thought at first. It only hits in dry years, but it'll hit every tree in root contact. Will go within 3-4 weeks. They just, boom, 30, 40 trees are down like that. And there's no recovery from the stem at all. Phragmites is a native plant, although it is not You know, it's a coastal plant, which is making phenomenal inroads in our inland wetlands. And it's an interesting phenomenon to see native plants beginning to behave in grossly, you know, just invasive ways as well. Although I won't use an herbicide on that. I think water management is the answer to Phragmites. It's not, it's just that we're creating habitat for it, that it's filling right and left, more than it's, you know, capable of obliterating a habitat. But again, you just have to look. You can go, there's an area, for example, I know one site where the Schwedleri purple maple has taken over now 6 acres of this hideous purple forest. It's the scariest thing. It's like another planet. And I keep thinking, God, if this is everywhere, we're really doomed. So you just have to look around. Evodia, for example, has taken over one whole hillside, but it still seems to be a natural escapee, and I'm not too worried about it. The biggies, you know, you just see them all. If it's everywhere, it's trouble. And you know, the federal agencies are giving up. The whole, California and Florida more than anything else, this sort of almost tropical environment. The Forest Service put about 2 years worth of effort, and I know a number of students who went down to join the brigades in alien obliteration. They gave up. They said the job is too big, it cannot be done. And our experience is that you just can't even think of giving up after 2 years. It does take, you know, at least 3 to 5 years to make some major inroads, but once you start to see improvement, it gets very dramatic. It's just as deterioration gets faster, and you know, you start to see the stream erode, and all of a sudden it's looking a little active, and you say, oh, got to do something about that, and then whammy, it's all fall apart. Recovery is the same thing. You know, once the fever's broken, recovery is fairly rapid. We're not seeing, I don't think we're not going to bring back anything like what was there on the East Coast. Our real hope is, can we even get a few of these sort of relatively intact places? Can we hang on to them long enough for the Norway maple to catch something fatal? Any other questions?
I have two.
Sure.
First is, do you deal with landfills or fly ash heaps at all?
Oh, this is a topic someone asked me about earlier. It was interesting. He said to me, it seems that stormwater management is your biggest issue on the East Coast. Out here it is waste disposal. We are very, very active in that, and I will make a personal plea to you right now is don't buy into that trash to steam garbage. It's a very, very problematic. One of the problems is that anything, since the 1950s, you were dealing with materials of such toxicity that it's just a whole different ball game. I mean, the old landfills, the old pre-50s landfills that were open burning pits and all, are very easy to revegetate. They're very reasonable sites to work with. A new capped landfill, A, has a leachate that is very, very scary stuff to deal with, and B, has tremendous problems with gas lockup, CO2 in particular, which is very bad. And without venting, they're very difficult to. The biggest problem I see, though, is that as bad as they are, everything coming out of the incinerator is worse. And I would rather be dealing with garbage as a problem than dealing with something that is verging on being something from a plutonium plant. The EPA, for example, is right now under tremendous pressure from the people who are pushing all this trash to steam to not regulate municipal fly ash, because old fly ash did not come under the standards of being hazardous. All that fly ash that is in the scrubbers now is hazardous to a degree that makes old fly ash look like child's play. And right now they're getting away with not treating it as a hazardous material by mixing it with regular fly ash and diluting it. The stuff that comes, you may get a 90% reduction in the waste stream in the trash to steam, but the 10% that you are dealing with is such a terrifying toxicity. And the part that is scariest is that the federal government is abdicating any responsibility for this on the grounds that it's like old fly ash. So it's like asking the fox to guard the hen house when it is up to the municipality to deal with that. My own, you people do have land. I'm certainly no fan of landfills, but I would opt for a well-run landfill before I would start creating materials that are so hazardous. I personally do not believe in the theory of safe containment. I don't think there's any such thing as a safe container. I am of the theory that if you have to bulk up the product 900 times rather than reducing it down to 10%, that it is a better way to get rid of it. The Dutch, for example, dispose of mercury by putting it into paper pulp processing, so that, you know, they're dealing with paper, and pulp is something that is such a huge volume of that you can begin to get rid of extremely toxic materials and disperse them basically back to ambient levels into the environment. And I think that is much more the direction we should be going in. Anytime you make a step that makes that material more scary, more hazardous, I think it's the wrong direction. And I think we're so obsessed with getting rid of it that we are buying into a very false, and as I warned my friend here, you go one corporate merger back, and every single one of those you will find a nuclear power plant set of players. Basically, there are no nuclear power plants being commissioned anymore, and all those people are out of work, for whether the big engineers, the boilermakers, et cetera, and they're all behind trash to steam. There are over 300 of them on the books in various municipalities across the country. Dayton, I believe, has one hardly functioning at a $7 million startup cost. Philadelphia's is already slated for a $280 million startup cost, and that's the price the mayor is willing to admit. You can imagine what the real price is going to be. I think it's absolutely terrifying. And if you people are facing trash to steam, I would organize, and being on the anti-trash to steam network, one of the biggest problems is that all the local, Pliny Fisk, for example, his wife, has been a very major activist in fighting trash to steam in Austin. And one of the things we found out is that all these local grassroots groups have been painfully trying to gather data and they're all at the same place, you know, and nothing, they really haven't found anything that is very good. There's a lot of non-information out there about it, but I would certainly look at that gift horse real hard in the eye. I think we use fly ash. I like fly ash. Pliny makes fly ash concrete. It's a real good way to get rid of fly ash.
How about that? Ground cover of
Well, I certainly wouldn't put it onto a field. A field is a nice place. You don't put fly ash in a nice place. The Palmerton zinc mine, however, a little fly ash and sludge, which would be a hideous contaminant somewhere else, actually would make a soil surface capable of supporting vegetation, which would begin a process that would be very fruitful on this site. Vegetation has a phenomenal willingness to take up toxic chemicals, heavy metals in particular, which is one of the biggest things we have difficulty dealing with, is heavy metals. I think they take them up because it discourages feeding by vertebrates like ourselves. I mean, it doesn't seem to bother the tomatoes to have cadmium in them, but it's certainly very problematic to the people. You know, at the Palmerton zinc mine, 2,000 acres are now shedding, 2 feet a year of utter dreck. And if you can get real forest established on that, a lot of that zinc is going to move right up into the biomass column. And then, the rate of delivery off-site will be when a tree dies and decomposes, rather than when 2,000 acres are running water because there's not a stick of vegetation on them. So I think redispersal, putting it in places that are already contaminated and trying to use less, you can almost always find a worse place to put a bad thing. So the very worst places get the next worst thing. So they're slightly improved, not much improved, but it's better than it was before. And just stay off of places that have not been destroyed. And there's certain, if once you have trash to steam, any incentive for recycling is lost. Any incentive for people to confront reduction of the waste stream. If we start really dealing with individual disposal appropriately, what people are going to find out is there's certain products they can't get rid of. And by golly, that's going to impact the market. And you'll have a good selectivity in the market. A number of hazardous waste managers are already commenting on the reduction in some of the product flow, largely because of the difficulty of handling the material. And I think trash to steam is a giant step in the opposite direction. You could be getting power off of every single sanitary landfill that is run in a sanitary. All you have to do is put that dirt on, day after day in that landfill operation, and you have a very ready supply of energy. It's not going to be as much energy as you would get off of a trash to steam plant, but it also costs you damn near nothing to harvest it. You just need a pipe system and, collect it. So I like using waste materials in places where they are relatively safe and, dispersing them in the environment. And I have no qualms whatsoever about using sludge and fly ash. I just use them carefully. I rather like them. I'm into making soil since I won't use topsoil, so I'll use all kinds of goofy things to make soil. You'd be very surprised at some of the things we put in the hopper trying to get soil out the other end, Yeah.
Leslie, do you know of many other firms around the country that are doing the kind of design and construction work?
Not really. Part of that problem, though, is that we put so much energy into studying our own area and trying to reinvent our own wheel that we are less in touch with other people than we would have been. One of the things that I find as I go around is that I'm beginning to meet more people. I'm not finding it very much at the level of professional practice, and I'm finding it very little other than at the level of theory in the universities. We are finding the most extraordinary things happening, not in this country. Places like Nicaragua are doing the finest reforestation work done in the world, I think, is being done in Nicaragua. The only people who are looking at reestablishment of native communities, not trying to find one species of magic tree that you can use anywhere, and most of that has come to a sort of grinding halt lately. We're also finding it in local activists who are doing remarkably interesting things. There's one farmer, for example, who's been working on, George Parmentier, for example, who does channel restabilization, is just a total screwball, an insane screwball. But he looks at a stream channel and he knows what is happening. And essentially what he does is to fell trees using the large mass that is pulled up by the root system to create a live boom which deflects the water, and he's essentially remeandering streams that now need a larger channel than they did before. And he's a genius. There are a whole bunch of guys who are putting beavers back into areas. I mean, every single, 90% of the streams in this country were for millennia shaped by beavers. It's such a simple way of dealing with the problem. If you're out in pastoral country and can tolerate a little flooding now and then, it is a very good way to get streams back. But no, I'm not seeing very much of it. And it's quite distressing. Or we see it in other fields, like Pliny, who's working with available materials and things like that. But they are. I mean, there still are other people. And I know they're more than I know about.
Do you think it has to be design build to really work?
Well, we're not design build. We were design build in the beginning because we never had enough money to. But the picture has totally changed. I mean, we were maverick outcasts at the people would throw tomatoes at, and the world changed around us. I would love to think of myself as extremely radical today, but I'm not anymore. What Abby Hoffman calls a frumpy, a formerly radical, upwardly mobile professional. The world has changed, People come, we started this continuing education for practicing landscape architects, which was something we're very interested in, since these people have been out there seeing this stuff not work. And the first course we gave for the New Jersey ASLA, we had, I guess, 35 people. Half of them were engineers, which blew me away. And we asked them why they came to this course. We asked everybody. And literally everybody in the same room said the same thing. My clients are asking me to put in wildflower meadows. My clients are asking me, and I have no idea. I wasn't trained to do any of this. And rumor has it you'll talk to me about something on the, tell me some of these things. It's just it's just like computers. It's just totally wide open. An utter amateur can wander in and really discover something. I mean, at that time, there was no more exciting time to be a landscape architect than now. I mean, you can, whether you have training or no training, the problems are changing faster than the curriculums are changing. I think it's just for anyone who has an activist spirit, a capacity to observe, and some level of commitment, you can go out there and really do something. Today, this guy, Joe Douglash, who started this restoration project in the Wissahickon, we've now got a very serious operation going, and a lot of planting is happening. We've now attracted an angel who's given $20,000 so that we can start tackling the real stormwater improvements. And we're going to set it up so that the park, we won't do it in the park till they make a matching grant. They got to come up with their $20,000 too. I'm not going to fix the park for the jerks who destroyed it in the first place because they decided police cars should be able to drive down the trails and things like that. So they filled all along the edges. You know, that kind of stuff. So I think it is grassroots local activism and people tackling very specific problems. You know, in the 50s and 60s, there was a fundamental belief that Crown Vetch or such and such a filter fabric that you could find a real cure-all panacea, and it's just bunk. You know, the problems out there are generic problems like mismanagement of stormwater. I mean, the problems are very, very generic. But you have to solve each problem very specifically. We were talking about trash to steam, and I said, why isn't someone saying, rather than having me argue about is trash to steam a good way or a bad way, we know full well nobody has solved the trash crisis. So why am I arguing over which way to do it when I know there is no way? Nobody has solved it. We ought to be sitting down as a community and saying, what are the standards by which we wish to solve our trash crisis? You have, for example, glass factories in a community like this. You have, you know, a local economy that might be terrified of things like recycling. You have a lot of pastoral land. These are all the available materials. These are the things that have to be brought into the solving of the problem of waste. And we don't happen to have the same set of conditions where we are. And I think every place is unique. The world is a living system. Ecology is the best way we have of describing, or systems theory is the best way, or fractal mathematics, depending on your field, the best way we have of describing what we see today. But the answers are unique to each place. There's no, there's no community that is really the same as any other. And I think until we have reached that level, we're not going to be really, what is it? Think globally, act locally. And I think that's the bottom line at every level. The schools can teach you how to think. They can open your eyes to the fact that there need to be new solutions out there. But I have 40% foreign students. Some of them will be going back to Malaysia, Nigeria. What can I tell them about Nigeria in a course when I'm talking to 40 people? Absolutely nothing. They just have to look. I think the biggest thing for us is when we encounter students, they believe it can't be done. They have a romantic wish that an ecological approach might be successful, but fundamentally it's been beaten out of them. And most of them, by the time they get out of school, are more discouraged than they were when they went into school. Instead of being on the threshold of their bright new careers, they're all panic-stricken because they realize they've chosen a profession where you can't earn any money whatsoever. And they're scared they won't have any satisfaction either. And I can't talk to you about the money part, but I can talk to you about the satisfaction part. Although when someone asked me, how do you fight cosmic despair, I had to confess it was sex and food and not anything else. Yeah.
Once you're gone, where do we get a steady stream of information from? What's your suggestion?
I would go out and study the real world. You know, it's out there in a drop of water.
You can look and look.
What do you care about? You know, I mean, there must be some reason you got into landscape architecture. What do you care about? I started out in plant succession. My interest was changing plant communities over time. I just looked at them and looked at them and looked at them. I went and apprenticed myself to scientists. I worked for nothing for people like Dr. Wary for the privilege of, talking to him. And I asked a lot of stupid questions, and I didn't mind the fact that people got very agitated at that. But now it's not a problem, I think I can see much better than I could before. I would find other people you can work. I tell this to people all the time. We would never, none of us would have survived on our own. I was already real beaten down 15 years ago when we started. I had a baby basically because I couldn't, I timed my child because I couldn't play damn Don Quixote anymore. I was so sick of tilting at windmills and having my boss come and cream me because I'd done something I was really proud of, And if we had not found that the four of us all somehow had this shared set of values, and if we had not joined up, we would not have survived. We might have survived in academia where I'd be telling you what I think might be true, but I'd certainly have no experience. It's only because, and when one of us got crushed, you could come back and let a fresh person go out and face it. But it's not so hard now. It's definitely not so hard now. People don't, there's a tremendous acceptance for this right now. The frustration is there are very few successful models. There are very few answers to those questions. That's where the frustration is. And you know, so one, I guess it was up in Toronto, one of them said to us, gee, those are all nice successes. What about some of the failures? Frankly, I'm traveling around, I'm not going to show you the failures, but if I were to show you the failures, I would give you exactly the same slideshow and just tell you the other parts. You know, how we gained significant negative information today is Goddard's wife, you know, the space scientist, the rocket scientist, every day, and she used to write in her diary, today we gathered a lot of significant negative information. And you know, the early years were a lot. I have more failed old fields under my belt than anybody. Why do you think we gave up planting? You know, everyone thinks we're so terribly clever. I gave it up because it doesn't work, you know. I know that. I'm not going to try that anymore. I did that already. So you just do it, do it, do it. And don't wait for the right. That's the most important thing. Don't go work for some slimeball bush pusher so that you can get enough money to do something important later on. Don't take in flywheel work in your office so that you have the privilege of funding. If you do that, you will never, ever, ever get down to the real business of ecological design, because you've already said, this is something I can only do when the stars are right, and you know, I'm not whatever. If you can't do it every damn day, there's no point. So you have to do it all the time. Don't do anything else. Always think this way and run it by everybody. Just run it by everybody. Say, what's going on? And every time you look at a landscape, you know, when I give people, I have a friend who, when you ask, how do you get to the University of Pennsylvania? He'll say, well, you know the Irish bar on the corner of 36th Street, you turn left there, and then when you come to Maloney, Speedy's Morris's bar over here, you turn right. You know, I give directions by, you know, that fabulous grove of tulip poplar that used to be there, but they cut down last week, and then you know, students are amazed because they'll bring in a leaf, and Carol and I can tell them the tree they got it from, because there's only one Quercus robur in Philadelphia or something like that. But if you really look at your landscape, you'll know it very well. You've been looking at it all these years. You have thousands of slides back there. You just never processed any of that information. You can know that, you know, my grandmother knew more plants than probably anybody in this room, with the exception of Harrison Flint and a few others. You know, it was easy. Everybody knew about the real world when we were real people. It was not hard. It's not the, you know, it's only the Victorians who taught us that you couldn't know about that. Perfectly reasonable. That's late.
Yeah.